Good evening, Ishaka. Looking forward to sharing this exam review with you, and I'm sure you'll all do extremely well, and we can talk about it on Monday. All right, so talk to you soon. I hope things are well in Ishaka, and they are still cold and a little bit snowy, rainy here, and we're ready for some sunshine. At least I am. I don't know about these guys. Yeah, ready for some sunshine. So, okay, we're going to get started. So, hang on. All right, how's everybody doing?
Good.
Good.
Yeah.
So, we have a busy day today, so I'm going to go quickly. So first of all, you guys know I left early last Friday to drive up to Canada to this conference, and you can't see it very well on this photo, but yeah, it's hard to see. But there was 1,000 people there. The place was packed out, and the topic was how and should we mix our Christian faith with politics? How do we incorporate what we believe into the public square? And they had a variety of great speakers on that subject. And it was basically a day-and-a-half summit. And just to give you a flavor, this is Andy Steiger. He coordinates the whole conference, and he runs the organization called Apologetics Canada. Okay, and so this was a dialogue that he had with this guy who looks like he's a reverend, but he said it's actually not. He just wears a collar so that when he's out and about, it's a sign to people. It's an expression to people that. It's an invitation for them to have conversations about religious matters with him. Anyway, he had a great discussion about the role of the Christian in the public square in politics. That was really good. I got to talk to him a little bit about it, and so that was good. There's more of this. These are just a bunch of pictures. This guy here talked about the issues we have with racial tensions and how do we overcome those. And so that was a good talk. Let's see. This guy had a good talk about the church and the state. This lady here, she's a member of Parliament in Canada, so she's like the equivalent of a congressperson. She's also a very strong Christian, and so she talked about how she integrates her faith into her job as a politician. Okay, and this guy talked about human dignity. This guy was a young kid on fire for apologetics, and it was great to see him there. This guy here did a sub-thing on abortion, so that was really good. Andy gave a talk, a really interesting talk about artificial intelligence, and he's doing his PhD thesis on basically what it means to be human. And so what distinguishes a human being from, say, a machine that could gain like human-like behavior. And it was really interesting. And we're starting to encounter some of these challenges. We're even seeing it on our movies. I don't know if any of you saw the movie Her. The movie Her was about a guy who gets an upgrade of Siri, basically. And hey,
I'm sorry, I was
welcome
here.
back. Thank you. You were here. Good to see you.
I had to get some drugs, so.
Oh, okay. Well, that's always important. So
yeah.
I'm glad you got the drugs.
Me too.
You're good to go.
Me too.
So you haven't missed anything. I'm just giving a quick field trip report of my time in Canada at an apologetics conference. So anyway, the movie Her was really interesting because it was basically this guy who gets an upgrade to Siri, his digital assistant. And the digital assistant now becomes his digital companion, and he actually falls in love with her. So he's having this conversation that ends up in a relationship, a romantic relationship with Siri, basically. And so that in itself introduces a whole slew of questions. Anyway, Andy's expertise is becoming in this area of artificial intelligence and what does distinguish human beings from the potential of machines. Okay, so that was that. All right, so enough of that. So long story short, great opportunities for apologetics in the Pacific Northwest. The next one coming up is tomorrow here at Villanova University. The Northwest Regional Evangelical Theological Society is having their meeting, and so that'll be good. At the same time, up in outside of Seattle, there's a conference with J. Warner Wallace, and at the same time, over in Bend, there's the Christian Youth Summit, which is very much introductory apologetic materials to people that are just a bit behind you guys. So all that's to say there's lots going on. I found out that there's one the 30th of this month up in Sequim. I'm going to go to that because it features a great guy, Justin Brierly. And then there's one in Bellevue, and then there's another one in October. So anyway, all that to say that there's lots going on. So as you get a taste of it through this class, remember that there are lots of opportunities for the next to keep going on this. Change that. Okay. All right. So today, again, busy schedule. And no, I know you've missed a couple classes. Don't fret. You'll do fine. All the materials accessible to you.
Okay.
What we're going to do today is I'm going to wrap up pretty quickly on the moral argument, which we dealt with yesterday. And then I'm going to launch into the review for the midterm. Okay, so let's do the last bit of the moral argument here, and then I'll talk about the midterm. So just to remind us of what the moral argument is, it's essentially that it's asking the question: if are these things that we call moral laws and duties, morality in general, right and wrong? There's things that we ought to do and things that we ought not to do. If those are real, what determines those? Okay, and essentially we say if we determine them, then they could be whatever we decide, and they're not objective; they're subjective. They're like the result of our thinking. But if they're the kind of things that are independent of our thinking, in the sense that they exist whether we believe them or not, or even whether we exist or not, if they're objectively true, then where did they come from? And the answer leads us to there's got to be a moral lawgiver. That's the essential gist of the argument. But the way we formulate it is in this formulation that it's if God does not exist, then objective moral values and duties don't exist. So if there's no moral lawgiver, then obviously there's no moral laws. But we discover that, in fact, there are these moral laws, and therefore there's got to be a moral lawgiver, therefore God exists. That's the basic argument. And last week we went through the premise one, basically talking about some of the language in particular, learning about what do we mean by objective versus subjective. Objective is about the thing itself. Subjective is about the person who is apprehending that thing. And so big question is whether morals are something that's part of us, or is it part of the actual thing itself? And we argue that it's actually the thing itself. We also talked about the distinction between what we call the sophisticated language is the ontology of morals. That is, it's a statement about its nature versus epistemology of moral things, which is our knowledge of them. So there's a distinction about the nature of objective morals and the knowing of objective morals. And those are two different things, and it's important that we distinguish between them. Okay, so epistemology has to do about subjective knowing. Ontology has to do with whether or not the thing exists independently. So we talked about that. We talked about, and we'll review this a little bit, we talked about some of the potential objections to God as being the source of objective morals. Could there be another source? Like, could they have evolved? Or do they just exist as these abstract things that just are there like numbers are, or they're like mathematical laws? We dealt with those questions. And we also dealt with the common objection that suggests that there's this dilemma. If we say that God is the source of objective morals, then the skeptic will pose what's called Euthyphro's dilemma, and you'll run into this a lot. And it's that, okay, we'll say God is the source. Now, the dilemma is this question: is something good because God wills it? Or does God will something because it is good, right? And the two things have problems with them, and that's what the skeptic is trying to expose and therefore destroy this argument. They say, if something is good because God wills it, then it seems like, well, then, whatever God wills, that's good. And so what if God wills the torture of babies? Well, then that would be good, right? Because God wills it. But we know that that's not right. So that's a problem. And then on the other hand, if God wills something because it is good, then God is like going, okay, what's good? He's referring to some law outside of himself, and then saying, oh, well, torturing babies is bad, therefore I'm going to will that you don't torture babies. And we expose the fallacy of that dilemma by saying it's a false dilemma. There's a third option. And that third option is the critical one, which is God wills something because he is good. His nature is the good from which his will comes. So it's not like he's reaching out someplace else beyond himself and figuring out what good is. And it's not that he's just arbitrarily making something up. It's that his nature is the good. God is good, right? He is good. And so that's the answer to Euthyphro's dilemma. So we dealt with those issues, and when it all comes back around, it seems very plausible that unless we have a moral lawgiver, i.e. God, then we don't really have moral laws. Okay, so that's premise one. Then we're going to turn our attention to premise two, which is, okay, but there are these moral laws. We know that to be true, and they do exist. And so let's cover that. So premise two is just that objective morals actually exist. And the best way to convince somebody of that is just by stating the impossibility of the alternative, that actually they don't exist. And it's easy to test this. So if you have a skeptic that's saying, actually there are no such thing as objective moral laws, you go, okay, well if that's the case, then just pick anything that person who's claiming there's no objective morals, that would be something that they would find offensive, and they'll immediately say, well, no, that's wrong. And then you go, yeah, but you just said there's no such thing as wrong. So are you saying you just prefer it this way? So for example, so ask somebody that's denying objective morality, say, okay, so should we execute homosexuals? Okay, would that be okay? Would that be just? Should we force people to believe in Christianity? So if they don't believe it, we lop off their heads? Is that okay? Should we enslave black people? Is that okay? No. So pick whatever their favorite thing is and say, do something radically against that. Okay? If there's no objective morals, then it's not wrong that I punch you in the face, right? It's not wrong. You might not prefer it.
I would argue in turn.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah. Bring it on.
About cultural
Yes.
morals.
Yes.
Cultural relativism.
Yes.
So my culture taught me that it's wrong to kill babies, but objectively, I don't think killing babies is wrong.
Mm-hmm.
But culturally, I was raised otherwise, and so I fight in this culture for us not to kill babies. But that doesn't mean that it's objective. It's just something that I was taught.
So culturally, the Nazis said it was okay to murder Jews, right?
Yeah.
So is it okay to murder Jews?
Not in my culture.
Is it okay in their culture?
It wasn't theirs, I suppose. Yeah.
Well, we said, well,
Do I?
they said it was, but so they subjectively said it was. Were they right or were they wrong?
To be consistent, I would have to say that in their culture they were right, because I have no say in that. It was their culture.
And that's where you lead. So if you embrace the idea that there are no objective morals and everything is subjective, then things like the Holocaust, no problem. We really shouldn't have gone to war to prevent that. No problem. Okay? So what if then in my family, that's my culture, it's okay to eat our babies? And so keep your police out of my family because we're going to eat our babies. Is that okay? Or should we send the cops in and send you to prison where you belong?
You're in my culture. You guys stop eating the babies.
Right. So I think that if you press people, they'll do one of two things. So especially on, okay, so the go-to like test thing is it okay to torture babies for fun? I mean, like, I don't care what culture you're in. It's objectively wrong to torture babies for the fun of it. And if you found any culture anywhere, you would say, we got to put an end to that. We have a moral responsibility to stop that action. Now, people will do one of two things. They'll concede the point and say, yeah, you're right, it really is wrong. Or they'll take it to that consistency and they'll admit that torturing babies for fun is actually okay if you're in the right culture. And that's where you end up with. And it's like, really? Okay. So you're going to pay that price. You're going to say that it's okay to torture babies for fun, even though you know it's wrong. You're just saying that to uphold your philosophy that there is no subjective, or there are no objective laws, and therefore there is no God. I can do whatever
So
I want.
getting into this argument is a layman's way of opening up somebody's mind to realizing that there probably is objective morals.
Absolutely.
So right now you're arguing with someone who's uneducated.
We're doing evangelism on the sneaky.
Okay.
Okay, when we challenge people with this idea of objective morals really do exist, it's pretty clear, and I'm not the cleverest one to come up with the scenarios, but for example, one scenario, you always want to get it so that they're stuck in a corner and they've got to say something is wrong. Okay, like, okay, I don't think your mentality of subjective morality is right, and I don't think that people like you ought to exist. So if you are telling me that there's no objective morals, then I'm going to kill you. Is that okay? And they'll say, no, you can't do that. And they said, well, why? There's no objective morality that says that's wrong. So because you're a subjectivist, I'm going to get rid of you because I don't like you guys. They'll say, no, you can't do that. And you go, aha, why can't I? Because it's wrong to do it, right?
Nah.
Oh, okay. So now you've got them saying, yeah, I guess you're right, there is something that is really wrong.
So just threaten to kill him and see how it goes.
That's right. I mean, you can take it to that point. And then once you're there, then you go, so why is that the case? There's got to be something besides ourselves, because if it's just ourselves, it is my word against yours, and it's like whoever's more powerful wins, and that's like that's a power-based morality. It's the whoever's got the power sets the law. Okay, and so if we disagree with that, then we reveal that there has to be a moral lawgiver. That's not ourselves. That's God. Okay, so that's our strategy to get people to recognize that in fact there is something that people will say is really wrong, and if it really is wrong, then there's got to be a really wrong moral lawgiver or somebody who gives that law that is really wrong. And that then leads us to the conclusion, therefore, God exists. Okay? So that's the power of the moral argument. And you're catching the wave of why, when I introduce this argument, it can be one of the most persuasive arguments. Because unlike the cosmological arguments and even the teleological arguments, which are dealing with subject matter that, you can kind of like, I don't really get this like Big Bang thing or expanding universe or fine-tuning, I don't get, I see. But when it comes to morals, we have that built into us, right? We have that sense of conscience that drives us to eventually be painted into a corner where we've got to admit there is something that's really right and something that's really wrong. And if you have that, then you've got to come to the conclusion that God exists. So it's a powerful, persuasive argument. So, okay?
I find trouble.
Yes.
I find trouble staying on target.
Yeah.
When getting into this corner.
Yeah.
Because what happens when I have these conversations is the person can't track me. Like I get them in this corner of like, so what you're telling me is that there's nothing wrong. So I've had this conversation at work, and they won't answer directly. They'll grab something just kind of random. Like it'll be like, well, science says, and they'll go this way.
Right.
And it's super distracting. Like I can't get them to focus on one subject. They'll just kind of dodge into another. How do I deal with that?
Yeah. It's so
I'm not strong enough because I don't know. It's hard for me.
You'll get there.
Yeah.
This is where this kind of stuff takes practice. Okay, and so let's see. I'm trying to think of a good analogy, but if you've ever put wallpaper up or flooring down or I'm trying to think of a better analogy, but let's just take wallpaper. You're wallpapering. Oftentimes you put wallpaper up and you get a bubble, and like there's a bubble, and you're trying to work it out, and you just end up pushing the bubble all over the place. You can't get rid of it, and so it's very easy for your person that you're talking to divert. That it's like they see the bubble, and then okay, I know where that's going, so I'm going to change the subject and go off on here. And you have stuff like, yeah, but okay, so how do you explain God, promoting slavery in the Bible, right?
Yeah.
What do you say to that?
Yes.
Right?
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Well, what about so you're saying God's the source of all moral good. So why does He promote slavery in the Bible? So you want to be careful. And this is where just practice and getting experience and having these conversations, putting yourself in a position where you can have these conversations and just see how they go and develop good ways to bring it back to the table. So in that case of the slavery thing, what we need to do is we need to say, and here it's kind of tricky because you'll have to understand it at a greater depth than the other person.
Yeah.
So what they're dealing with there when they bring in slavery, they're bringing in a question of epistemology about morals rather than ontology about morals. So they're changing the subject from do objective morals exist to is this thing how do we understand whether slavery is right or wrong?
So
Okay.
my response would either, because like my immediate response would be like, well, hang on. Like there's two ways. Like, hang on, first of all, God didn't do that. You're wrong.
Yeah.
But before I can say that, I have to be like, well, wait, hang on a second. We're still on the topic of whether morals exist or not.
That's right, exactly. Regardless of what they are, regardless of our knowledge of what they are, we've got to first say, do they even exist at all? Do they exist, and is it something subjective, right? That's the question of, do we know what they are? Or are they something that exists outside of ourselves? And that's where you bring in the example of like torturing babies for fun. Is that something that we just prefer not to do? Or is that something that's really, really wrong, that the act itself is wrong? And so navigating those waters and keeping them on the core thing of whether or not something is right or wrong. And so before you let the question start going into, okay, so how do we know what's right? What is the source of our knowledge of that? Let's come to an agreement on whether or not they exist at all. And do they exist independently of us, or are they something that is simply us? Is it subjective or objective? So, yeah, but they are tricky conversations. And so what you can find yourself involved in is now you go down the rabbit hole of, yeah, but God didn't really promote slavery. And so, well, now let's open up the Bible, and now you got to start going through all the passages and exegesis, putting it in their context, and now you're diverted away from the core question. Bring them back to some example where, because you know the person, you bring them back to an example where they're admitting that yes, this is really wrong, like putting to death anybody who disagrees with my subjective morality is the right thing to do. So, okay. Good way there is a great, if this class was longer, there's a whole category of apologetics, which is taking this knowledge, taking these arguments, and now practically learning how to apply them. And that's called tactics. How do we tactically use these? If we use the war metaphor, we've got all these weapons now. We've got these defense and these shields, and okay, now what do you do with them, right? How do you go out and what does your battle plan really look like? And that's a different subject. And there's a great resource called Tactics. The book is Tactics. There's a whole DVD, and it goes into detail about how you navigate conversations with these tools in an effective way. Okay, so we got to move on. Any last questions about the moral argument? Okay, so let's move on, and I'm going to go through and let me preamble. And I'm talking to you in Ishaka as well. So I'm going to walk through the material that I want you to know, and I want you to be able to, at least on paper, to be able to answer these core questions. And I've structured the exam a little bit differently than most exams by saying this is open book, this is take home. So spend as much time on it as you want. It's not so important at this time that you memorize all this stuff. It's more important that at least one time you've written it down, and you'll be able to go back to what you've written and refer to it, refresh your mind. And this is all stuff that's either in the book or we've covered in the presentations that are accessible to you on Populate. And I will email you the exam after class, and you'll have until Monday to email it back to me. And so just get it back to me before midnight, Monday, March 11th. And I fully expect you guys to be totally capable of acing this. So the only reason you would not do well is if you, A, just didn't take the time and pay attention. Yeah, that's really the only way. So that makes sense? Any questions on that? So I'm going to email you the exam probably after this class or this afternoon or something, and you've got a couple days to go through it. Because I'm making it in this format and giving you a lot of grace in it, it's kind of long. So you're going to be mad at me going, oh man, this is a lot of work. But that's the way I'm doing it. Okay, so usually I like to have more dialogue in our class, and I will return to that next week. And so I'm doing less of the talking. This time, though, I'm going to just walk you through this whole thing, and by the end of it, you'll be fully equipped to do the exam. And this will be a test for me, too, because I don't have the answers. These are all off the top of my head. So hopefully I won't stumble on any of my own questions. So, number one, what is the task of apologetics? Okay, the task of apologetics is really defending the faith. It's both defending and contending. So defending is more of a providing answers to challenges. Contending is proactively saying why it's true. So on the one hand, it's defensive. On the other hand, it's offensive. That's the primary task of apologetics, is providing reasons for why we believe what we believe. So how would I correct somebody who thinks apologetics is just saying sorry for Christianity? Well, first of all, I would say that I understand your confusion, but recognize that the root of apologetics is apologia, which is the Greek word for defend. So it's not saying we're sorry, apologizing, being remorseful or repentant about our Christianity. No, it's defending it, because the apologia is defense. So don't confuse the two. How would I answer someone who says apologetics is actually unbiblical and that we just need to take Christian truth on faith? There have been people who say that this project of apologetics is actually anti-faith. Okay? Because we're just, if you get into reason and all that stuff, then you're like not believing things on faith. So the way I would answer that is that that's a fundamental misunderstanding of what faith means from a Christian standpoint. Faith from a Christian standpoint isn't blind faith, believing something for no reason. Or worse, believing something against all the evidence. It's not that. Biblical faith is believing something for good reason, trusting in the Christian truth. And so building that trust is what apologetics is all about. In fact, we're commanded to do that. So you say it's unbiblical, I say we're commanded to. And 1 Peter 3:15 says, always be ready to give an answer for the hope that you have within. And Jude says, contend for the faith given once for all to the saints. So there's many places where we're commanded to do this exercise. It's part of our evangelism. It's part of the gospel. And we look at Paul. Wow, what an apologist. The book of Romans is one big defense of the gospel. That's what he did. That's what the book of Romans is an apology. It's a defense of the gospel of grace. And he was taking that defense to the synagogues, the Jewish people, and then to the Greeks, and contending for that and defending it. So absolutely it's biblical, and we as the body of Christ need to do this as a community, and some of us are called out from that body to do this with a lot of vigor, but always with gentleness and respect. Okay. What are three things that apologetics defends against? Okay. Three things that apologetics defends against. remember this.
The false doctrines, false religions, and false doctrines, religions, and
Philosophies.
philosophies. Thank you.
There you go. Okay? Thanks. See, these are the kind of things I gotta go, wait, what is that? Okay? Yes. False religions, false philosophies, and false doctrines. What are three things that apologetics argues for? Christian theism, Christian doctrines, and probably Christian a Christian worldview. Okay. What is the difference between theology and apologetics? These two are intimately intertwined, but there is a distinction, and it's very simple. Theology teaches what we believe. Apologetics teaches why we believe that. Theology is about the what. Apologetics is about the why. Okay? All right. There's different approaches to apologetics. And those four different approaches are, that we talked about, there's more, but presuppositional apologetics is one approach. Evidential is another approach. We've been dealing a lot with evidential. Experiential is another one. Cultural is a fourth one. Briefly explain each approach. Presuppositional is kind of a top-down. It's saying that unless Christianity is true, so we presuppose that Christianity is true. Unless that's true, then nothing else makes sense. And the way to think about this is that even reason itself cannot exist without the Christian God. Okay, so we need, if we're going to reason our way to through our apologetics, the very act of reasoning presupposes the existence of God, because without God, we couldn't be reasoning. That's what the presuppositionalist will approach it by saying, basically, if Christianity isn't true, then nothing else makes sense. The only way we can make sense of the world is by assuming that Christianity is true. So that's one approach. Evidential is more of a bottoms-up. Okay? So presupposition is taking God as a starting point and are working our way down and showing that nothing else makes sense without that. Evidential is starting at the bottom and working our way up to these arguments for God. And that's the approach that we've been taking in this class for the most part. Looking at the evidence from nature, looking at the evidence from our conscience with the moral argument, and then we'll be looking at the evidence for the greatest miracle of all, which is the resurrection of Christ. We'll be looking at evidence for why we believe that, and we'll get to that after this midterm. Experiential is our personal experience, our encounter with Christ, our indwelling of the Holy Spirit. And it's our testimony to the truth of this that we experience, which is defending why we believe. Why do I believe what I believe? Ultimately, I believe what I believe because God, through His Holy Spirit, changed my heart and gave me a heart that could that knew that He was true. Then cultural apologetics is basically taking things that are happening in the world and using them to make arguments for the existence of God. For example, so many of the stories that we hear that we're all familiar with, either through kids' stories, fairy tales, novels, movies, what we hear in our music, what the arts portray, all speak in one way or another towards the existence or non-existence of God. Bless you.
Thank you.
So when we look at stories about self-sacrificial heroes in movies. This is like, I can't tell you, all the superhero movies end up with the superhero. He needs to, like, he's all powerful, but he's got to somehow sacrifice himself in order to save the world, right? And we just resonate with that idea. Well, guess what? This is what Jesus did, right? Jesus was all powerful, but he sacrificed himself so that man could live. These are all of our stories, our good ones at least, have a basis for this underlying truth that is in the Christian story.
So what you're telling me is, if all the winds obey Jesus,
Yes.
and if all of matter obeys Jesus,
Yeah.
Jesus is Superman. If he wanted to, he could fly around.
Absolutely.
Jesus is Superman.
And
He did come.
and Superman had his kryptonite, right? Jesus had his cross. He had to go bear the cross.
Except that he chose. That's
true. So, well, Jesus became a man. That was his kryptonite. Jesus made himself so that he could die, and he did that willingly. So, anyway, there's a whole field of this overall apologetics project that is really fascinating. It is looking at the culture and then extracting from it the underlying truth and showing people this is what you're really resonating. When you see Superman, what it's doing is it's showing you a picture of Christ. And that's what your soul is resonating with. You need to make that connection. And so identifying that is really cool. Looking at the Lord of the Rings and seeing how the different, looking at the Chronicles of Narnia and seeing how these deep underlying Christian truths are being shown in a way, in an imaginative way that people will glom onto, and that will hopefully, well, not hopefully, but those can be tools that awaken our hearts to that underlying truth. So these different approaches, they're not like in conflict with each other. They should all be integrated into one, and we use them depending on the audience that we're approaching and the context in which we're approaching it. So, so it's a big category of thought, and so that's what these different approaches are. What are the three primary goals of all of these approaches? There's really three that I see. I think that the book summarizes it pretty well up front, and it is this, that we want to strengthen the faith of believers. So there's nothing like getting a big dose of these evidential arguments that we're going, wow, I mean, I believed before, but wow, now I'm like even more convinced, and now I feel like, ooh, I'm strengthened. This is the Holy Spirit just equipping us, and it's part of our sanctification process that we learn that our strength, our faith grows every day, stronger and stronger and stronger. So that's the first one, is strengthening believers. The second one is winning unbelievers. Okay? And I always want to be a little bit careful of saying it that way, because it's the Holy Spirit that wins unbelievers. But he uses these tools as the means to that end. It's the Holy Spirit that changes the hearts of men so that they can believe. Faith is a gift from God. Ephesians talks about that. But the way we receive that is often through these arguments. Okay, so we evangelize unbelievers, maybe a better way to do it. We preach the gospel through these evidences, through this these answers, through this faith that we're contending with. So that's the second thing. And then the third thing is shaping our culture. We talked about the cultural apologetics, and a goal of apologetics is to present to the world a rational reason for why we believe what we believe, and show the world that this is the only thing that really makes sense. And we want to shape our culture in such a way that we actually can proclaim this good news in our universities, in our politics. I just got done talking about this conference about how do we be Christians in the political sphere. Well, if you're well equipped with these good arguments that you can go and you can make policies and you can defend why those policies are there because you believe what you believe and you know why. A good example is abortion, right? So as a politician, you might go in with a real clear goal of changing the laws of our nation about abortion because you believe it to be murder, because not just from a Christian perspective, but from even a human perspective, and you're equipped to make that argument. Okay, so those are the three things: strengthening the believers, evangelizing unbelievers, and shaping our culture. I think those are the primary goals of apologetics. All right, so let's take a little break and start in on the other part of what we learned. Okay, take a break. Okay, we're back. All right, hang on for the last bit of this ride, and then we'll be done. Okay, so we kind of frame this whole, before we get into the foundational arguments of the existence of God, we talk about this idea, and that is that without God, life is what's called absurd. And we face head-on the importance of this conversation about the existence of God, because the claim is that if God doesn't exist, then life is absurd. So it really makes a lot of difference whether or not God exists. We can go through our life day to day and think, well, whatever, it doesn't really matter. But it really, really does. And this is why. Absurdity is simply a big word to say that that there's no meaning, no purpose, no value in life. Okay? So the three qualities to life that are lost, if this is true, if God doesn't exist, and if life is absurd, the three qualities that we lose are purpose, value, and meaning. Okay? Without God, who is the purposer, who is the source of meaning and the source of values, if we don't have an anchor in God, then those things, just like we've had the conversations about morals, those things disappear. Okay? We can create our own purpose and our own values and our own meaning, but if there's something that we create, then they are subjective and they can change, and if they can change, then there's no real ultimate standard by which they are judged. And without that ultimate standard, then they're arbitrary and they might as well not exist. Okay? So that's a good preamble to recognize the importance of addressing this question of whether God exists or not. And the book of Ecclesiastes, I think, is like one of my favorite philosophical books in the Old Testament, and written by arguably the wisest man on earth, who recognized the wisdom that accompanies the existence of God. So he does this by essentially making the argument that without God, everything is meaningless. And it's both an awesome book, but at the same time, an often very misunderstood book. And this is why it's misunderstood. And this is the thing I want you to take away. There's one key qualifying phrase in the book of Ecclesiastes that we have to understand. Because when it goes through and talks about how everything is meaningless and I tried this and everything is vain and blah, 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 it's like super depressing. But what he's describing is life under the sun. That's the key phrase. It means without God. Just read that. Everything is meaningless without God. If God doesn't exist, then, all these projects I did are meaningless. There's just, everything is worthless. So, the flip side of that is that with God, however, everything does have meaning. And the conclusion of the matter, when he gets to the very end of the book, is that the most important thing we can do is revere God, acknowledge that he exists, and attribute to him the worth that he is due, and obey his commandments. And then everything that flows from there now has meaning and has value and has purpose. Without God, it doesn't. With God, it does. So when you read Ecclesiastes next time, be thinking about these concepts of meaning, value, and purpose in life, what those are under the sun, that is without God, and what those are with God. And they're radically different, and that's the big divide, which is why this question of whether he exists or not is so important. All right, related to this, I really like what the Westminster Confession tells us about purpose. Yes, sir.
Is this part of the still continuation of the midterm?
Yes. This is all midterm exam review, so you will find essentially these questions on your midterm, but you'll be able to answer them in your own words very well. Okay? So, for example, when I ask you the question in the book of Ecclesiastes, what is the main qualifying phrase you put under the sun? That'll be an easy one to answer, but just because it's easy doesn't mean it's not important. Really important. I can't tell you how many people have missed the entire point of Ecclesiastes and totally misinterpret it because they don't catch that under sun. I always wonder what that was. Well, that's the key thing. Okay, enough of my soapbox. All right. According to the Westminster Confession, what is the chief end of man? End means purpose. End also is the root telos, which we'll get to when we talk about the teleological argument. So, does anybody remember this? It's a good one to memorize, because when somebody asks you, what is the purpose of life? It's nice to be able to roll it off your tongue like you think about this all the time, which we should. So,
I always thought of it as the glorify God.
and?
Serve God.
Glorify God and? There's one more thing. It's not serve. That's part of glorifying. Chief end of man is to glorify God and to enjoy him forever.
Really?
It is.
Well, that makes complete, yeah.
Good.
Yeah.
I can't think of a better one-liner to have roll off the tip of my tongue, have ready for when somebody says, all right, well then what is the purpose of life? Oh, I'm glad you asked. It's to glorify God and to enjoy him forever. That's what we're all about. You want to come with me? Let's do this. Let's glorify God and enjoy him forever. Sound good, right?
I don't usually think about that second part, but it's absolutely
Absolutely. He is a loving Father, and his purpose is for us to enjoy him forever. And it's like when you start thinking about that, that packs a lot of stuff in a couple words. So memorize that. So it took me a while to memorize it, so I'm putting it on your test so you can start. Okay. All right, so now we get into our foundational arguments here. Again, I'm going to go quickly here, so hang with me. You can always watch this on YouTube, and just watch the YouTube video and do your test at the same time. Man, I shouldn't have said that. That'll make it too easy. But you can do that. What is the question that the Leibniz cosmological argument is asking? Anybody remember?
Why is there something rather than
Whew, I love how that rolls off your tongue. I like this roll off. Yes, that is precisely. Why is there something rather than nothing? Great conversation starter. Hey, you want to have a cup of coffee? I got a big question I've been struggling with. Why is there something rather than nothing? You ever thought about that? And somebody will say, no. It's like, no, think about it. Think deeply. There's stuff. There didn't have to be stuff. Why is there stuff? why are you here? Why are the molecules that make up your body here? You ever thought about that? It's a good question. Well, there is this guy, can't remember his first name, but his name was some weird German name, Leibniz. He thought about this, and when he was all said and done, he decided that there had to be some explanation for why there's something rather than nothing. And that explanation can't be itself. It's got to be something outside itself. That explanation is what we call God, who is the source of all being. Why is there being? Because there is a ultimate being. There is the self-existent one. That is God. The syllogism for the Leibniz cosmological argument, and a syllogism is simply a fancy word to say what's the step-by-step logical argument, is everything that exists has an explanation for its existence. Everything that exists has an explanation for its existence. The universe exists, therefore the universe has an explanation for its existence. And, we go on to say, and that explanation is what we call God, therefore God exists. Okay, critical in this whole argument is understanding the difference between a contingent being and a necessary being. A contingent being means its existence is contingent upon something else. It's dependent on something else. A necessary being exists by itself necessarily. It cannot not exist. And we made the argument that the only necessary being is actually God. God is the only thing that necessarily must exist. Everything else is contingent upon that necessary being.
And besides stuff like numbers.
We talk about numbers, and many people argue that abstract objects like numbers and like laws of arithmetic are also necessary beings. But I think it's better to say that they also are contingent upon the mind of God to even think of such a thing as numbers. And so even numbers, even though they seem like these abstract entities, are themselves contingent upon the mind of God. That's my theory. A Platonist, if you ever hear somebody being referred to as philosophically a Platonist is somebody who believes that there is this separate realm of existence in which all of these abstract objects actually exist as real things. And those real things are independent of God. And so I don't believe that, because I believe that those things that we call abstract objects really only have their existence in the mind of God. So it's from the mind of God who thinks of things as like numbers or laws of mathematics, and that if God didn't exist, then those things wouldn't exist. Therefore, they're contingent upon God. God is the only necessary being. That's the argument. Okay? The next argument. What is the question that the Kalam cosmological argument is asking? Remember that?
Something that exists, it must have been a beginning.
Perfect. Exactly. Okay? If something begins to exist, it must have had a beginner. The something that we refer to is usually the universe. We say, hey, if the universe had a beginning, then there must have been a beginning. Okay? So the syllogism is that. Anything that begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist, therefore the universe has a cause. These are nice because they're like so pretty. Once you try them out a few times, they're pretty easy to remember. And you can like rattle them off to your friends and get them thinking. And these are rock solid arguments. It's not like, well, you know, there's maybe that's your opinion. No, this is rock solid. This is like 1 + 1 = 2. If the premises are true, then the conclusion necessarily follows. Okay? People like these rock solid, like deductive arguments. Okay, so that syllogism there is based on a major premise, and that is that the universe began to exist. So we need to know the reasons why we believe that the universe began to exist. And we had really several arguments. There was one philosophical argument and one scientific argument. Well, that's what I want you to say. So the philosophical argument has to do with the impossibility of an actual infinite. So if the universe didn't have a beginning, that is, it eternally existed, that would mean that an actual infinite has to exist. And because we know that actual infinites cannot exist, therefore the universe cannot be infinite. Okay? So that's the basic idea there. You don't have to go into all the reasons why. You can look at the book for the reasons why. It's sufficient just to make the statement that the challenge is that a universe without beginning and without end would imply an actual infinite. And since we know that actual infinites cannot actually exist, therefore, since the universe does exist, it can't be actually infinite. It can't be eternal. So that's the philosophical argument. One of the scientific arguments, there's multiple, so I'll take any one of them, but the argument from entropy is a good one. The universe is running down, and if it's running down now, it can't be eternal because it would have run down by now. So the fact that we're still in the process of running down means that at one point it had to have a beginning. The other scientific argument is the arguments that point to a beginning of the universe through both the redshift of the starlight, which shows that all of the universe is expanding, and if it was expanding today, it had to be contracting in the past. And if you run the clock all the way back, it contracts into nothingness. And at that point, that's when it began to exist. So, redshift, arguing for the expansion of the universe, which implies the beginning of the universe, is a good scientific argument. And entropy is a good scientific argument for why the universe began to exist. So that's the main support of that second premise of the Kalam cosmological argument, which is the universe began to exist. If the universe began to exist and we have philosophical and scientific reasons for it, then it must have a beginner, it must have a cause. Okay? So that's that argument. This is important. What is the key difference between the Leibniz one and the Kalam one? And this is where we can get confused a bit, and we've got to be precise with our language. And the key difference here is that when we're asking, why is there something rather than nothing? The premise is, between the Leibniz, is that everything that exists has an explanation. Okay? It doesn't say everything that begins to exist has a cause. That's the Kalam. The Kalam says everything that begins to exist has a cause. The Leibniz one is everything that exists, whether it's eternal or not, has an explanation for its existence. So the Leibniz doesn't care about whether it's existed eternally or finitely. The Kalam does. That's the key difference. All right. Oh, I'm doing good here. I might even end early. Okay. What question is the teleological argument asking? The root telos means the end. It means finish. It means the purpose towards which something is directed. We remember this word. I think this is a convenient way to remember that when Jesus was on the cross, taking his last breath, he said, "Tetelestai, it is finished, paid in full." That the goal which I was sent here, purpose why I was sent here, is now complete. I've done it. So it has to do with purpose. So the teleological argument has to do with purpose, has to do with design. It's like things are designed for a purpose. The question that the teleological argument is asking is, we see all this evidence for design. What's the source of that design? The argument is that the source of that design is a designer, and that designer is God. There's two main areas of study that this argument addresses, that we've covered, I should say. And one is by looking at the design in the universe through our telescopes. That's the big picture. The other area is looking at the design in life that we look at through our microscopes. So that's the way I remember it. One is looking out at big things with the telescope. The other is looking inward at little things through the microscope. So cosmology, biology. Both things exhibit design like you wouldn't believe. Now, as we look at that first one, looking at the cosmos through our telescopes, what we discover is this thing called fine-tuning. So how do we explain the concept of fine-tuning? It's basically this, that there are certain qualities in our universe, and those qualities are basically the fundamental constants of physics, and the other is like the initial conditions, how the universe started out. And you can think of those as like the laws of physics. And in those laws of physics, they are set up in such a way that as the universe unfolds, it ends up being that life can exist in this universe. And if any of those constants of physics or initial conditions were even slightly different than what they were, then life could not exist. So like a guitar with strings that you have to tune precisely for it to sound good, the same way if the universe, if those if those constants and initial conditions aren't tuned, aren't selected just right, then the universe will sound terrible. That is, it won't be able to support life. Okay? So then the question becomes, what is the source of that fine-tuning? And, you know, in practice here, it's good to have some examples to point to. Like, you know what, if the gravitational constant were any different, then solar systems couldn't work. The entire universe would collapse on itself or expand away such that planets could never form. And if we couldn't have planets, we couldn't have life. If the strong or weak nuclear forces were any different than what they are, then chemistry couldn't happen. And if you don't have chemistry, you don't have the chemistry of life. Therefore, life doesn't work. And these are, you may encounter people who will push back a bit and say, well, that's just life as we know it. But this is like way more foundational. So these things are dealing with whether galaxies or stars can even exist, or chemistry can even exist. And so if you're saying that you can imagine life where there's no atoms, there's no chemistry, there's no planets, there's no galaxies, okay, I can't imagine that. So, what are three possible explanations for the fine-tuning of the universe? So, after we get over, like, yes, the universe is fine-tuned for life, there's three possible explanations. One is that it just had to be that way. If it's that way necessarily, it couldn't be any other way. But we know that that's not true because there's nothing in the laws of physics and those constants or initial conditions that say they have to be that way. You could simulate a universe where those constants were completely different, and you would have completely different universes, but they're all possible, they're not necessary. So once you say that it's possible that the constants could be different than what they are, then clearly they're not necessarily so. So that's one answer, that those things are necessarily so. The second explanation is that they happen by chance. Okay, and that's when you get into, all right, well, let's look at the probability that they just happen to be what they are. And when you work out the probabilities of even a handful of these fine-tuning factors, these fine-tuning parameters, you see that the probability of they being what they are to support life is literally astronomically small, essentially zero. That they would all converge to be just those that preserve life, that allow for life, is infinitesimally tiny. So that's the second. So necessity, chance. And the third possibility is that they were designed to be what they were by a designer. And that's the approach that we're going to say is most plausible. So the most plausible is if you're open to the idea of a God, a supernatural being outside of the physical universe, then the idea that he designed the universe in such a way that it would support life is completely plausible, and it makes the most sense. So only if you reject the idea of God in the first place will you say that that's not a plausible, and in this case, the most plausible explanation for these fine-tuning things. One thing that you might get pushback on, this won't be on the exam, but we talked really briefly about what's called the anthropic principle. And the anthropic principle is the observation that, hey, unless the universe was fine-tuned, we wouldn't be around to see it fine-tuned. So therefore, since we can see it fine-tuned, obviously it had to be fine-tuned. Otherwise, we wouldn't be here talking about it. So the key thing with that is to recognize that what the anthropic principle is a description of the way things are. It's not an explanation of why it's so. Okay? It's saying, well, yeah, for sure, if the universe wasn't fine-tuned, then we wouldn't be here to say it. But that doesn't explain why we are here and why we live in this fine-tune. It's just a statement of fact, not an explanation. Okay? That's important, and I went for a while in my journey not really understanding that distinction, and I kept getting confused about what this anthropic principle was. And because too often people use it as an explanation when it's not. All right, what's another property that seems to accompany the design of the universe for life? So it's great, we have this fine-tuning that gives us this amazing planet that allows us to live. But this is important to know just because it's kind of a marvelous fact. And that other property is that it seems like the very things that are necessary for life itself are also necessary for discovery. That life can then discover things about the universe. And that's an area that is fairly new in the area of apologetics, and it'll be interesting to see how scientists continue to build on this idea that, wow, the very things that we now understand are critical for life to exist are also the very things that they better be that way, otherwise you'll never discover anything. Wow, that's God showing his true colors. That God could so design the universe such that it's the very things that allow us to live, that allow us to discover, that then give us no excuse for not submitting to him. Okay? That's the teleological argument from a cosmological standpoint. The other tack was to, as well as looking out through our telescope, seeing design in the universe, we look in our microscope to see design in life. So here we need to have a basic understanding of neo-Darwinian evolution, because that's the explanation that is proposed to explain life. Okay? And so Darwin basically proposed this, that that organisms replicate, they multiply, and every time they multiply, there's slight mutations, slight changes that just occur naturally. And we see this all the time. We see that there's slight variation from one generation to the next generation. And he made the simple argument that if some of those mutations are beneficial, then those offspring will have a better chance of surviving. And if they have a better chance of surviving, then they will pass on that mutation to their next generation. And that generation will take that, and if they too have slight changes that benefit them, then they'll get better and better. In other words, organisms have a tendency to adapt to changes in their environment and be better and better fitted for survival. That process is called natural selection. So the forces of nature are such that the fittest will survive. So it's the survival of the fittest, and as things gradually change generation to generation, that process will eventually build up to a bunch of little changes adding up to big changes. And if you take that to the extreme, then eventually those successive generations will be completely different species, completely different families, completely different orders, and so if we, again, rewind the clock backwards, we can see all of these species that we see today rewinding backwards into a common single ancestor that explains how everything else came to be. Okay? That famous tree of life and the process of random mutation with natural selection explains it all. We don't need the designing hand of God. We have the designing hand of nature in this process. Okay. Neo-Darwinianism takes it one step further and talks about the source of the mutation is in the genetic code that's contained in the DNA. And that is the source of the mutation. And over time, those mutations add up to a few beneficial ones, and those are the ones that survive. Okay, what are the three major challenges to this theory? Well, there's multiple challenges, but here's probably the best three. Number one is that Neo-Darwinian evolution assumes that there is the first life. It has no explanation for how life first began. It only works once you have self-replicating organisms. And how did we get that first self-replicating organism is outside of the Darwinian explanation. So you've got to, it's like, you've got to get to first base before you can keep going. How do you get to first base? So the origin of life is a major challenge to Darwinian evolution. The second major challenge is the fossil record doesn't match the prediction of this slow, gradual change over time. Instead, what we see, and most pronouncedly, we see it in what's called the Cambrian explosion. And this is a period of time in which vast amounts of new species came into existence, essentially all at once. And that is in direct contradiction to the foundation of neo-Darwinism. So the evidence doesn't match the theory. When the evidence doesn't match the theory, you get a new theory. So that's the second challenge. The Cambrian explosion. That would be the major thing I would say. The third challenge is structures in biological systems that we call irreducibly complex. And irreducibly complex simply means that you've got to have you have systems that the only way they work at all is if they all have all the pieces all in the right place at the right time all together. You can't, foundationally, you can't build this thing piece by piece by piece by piece by piece. You can't build it like a quarter of the way and have it do a quarter of the work, halfway and have it half work. No, it's all got to be there. It's all or nothing. And there are tons of these type of systems in biology that have this property of irreducible complexity. So the neo-Darwinian mechanism can't explain how those things came together piece by piece by piece because they can't. They have to all be together all at once or they don't do anything at all. So that's what we mean by this term irreducible complexity in biological systems, is that things have to all be together for them to form any function at all. And you can't build up irreducible complex systems piece by piece, as the Darwinian mechanism would suggest. Okay? So neo-Darwinism in a nutshell, the failure of evolution to explain the design in life is that it has no explanation for the origin of life. The fossil record in the Cambrian explosion contradicts it, and this irreducible complexity characteristic that we find in so many biological systems refutes it as well. Okay, so if we don't have that as an explanation, then a better explanation is that there was a designer, and that designer is God. Okay, so our last argument that we've just wrapped up on is the moral argument. So I would like you to explain the moral argument in your own words. And in my words, it's basically that, hey, if there's moral laws, there's got to be a moral lawgiver, right? And then you let the conversation go. You get into, well, do moral laws really exist? Well, are they objective or are they subjective? So what is the difference there? That's my next question. What is the difference? Objective ones, objective morality means that the object itself is right or wrong. Subjective means we think that that thing is right or wrong. It's about us rather than about the thing. So that is the question. Are morals something that are objective, true about the thing, or are they subjective, a statement about us? That's a key distinction. Related to that, what is the difference between ontology and epistemology when we're discussing morality? Ontology has to do with the existence, the nature of morality. Is the nature a property of the thing, the act, or is it a property of ourselves? Epistemology is knowing then what is right or wrong. It's not arguing whether right or wrong exists. It's asking the question, okay, it exists, so what is right and what is wrong? What is good? What is evil? What is, those are the things. So epistemology is about the subject. Ontology is about the object. It's important to know the difference between the two. What is Euthyphro's dilemma and how can it be resolved? We just talked about that earlier on, but this is the dilemma that is usually thrown in our face when we're saying that objective morality only exists if God exists. And they'll say, yeah, but what about this? Is something good because God wills it, or does God will it because something is good? And in both of those things, it kind of wrecks your idea of God. So what do you say to that? So what I say is, oh, you've presented Euthyphro's dilemma. And there's two horns to that dilemma. But guess what? I have a third option that splits the horns of that dilemma. And that option is this. It's not that God wills something because it is good, or something is good because God wills it. It's that God wills something because He is good. He is the core foundation. He is the ontology of goodness. So His nature is good, and from His nature comes His will. That's how we explain it. And so much for your Euthyphro's dilemma. Okay, so how would you respond to someone who claims that objective morals don't exist? And we just pick up the favorite thing that that person would like say that's wrong, and you go with that. And we might have to fish around a little bit, but I like the one. I'm liking this more and more the more I practice it, and that is that. If you say that objective morals don't exist, you're a bad person, and I'm going to get rid of every one of you. And he's going to say, no, you can't do that. And I say, why not? Well, because murder is wrong. Well, you just told me that the morals don't exist. That's just your opinion. My opinion is that murder is fine if I'm murdering somebody who doesn't believe in objective morals, so where's my knife? Where's my gun? Let's do this. It's a good thing to get rid of you guys. And he'll protest and reveal that actually there is this objective moral, which is you don't murder somebody because they don't believe in objective morals. So that's a good response. Okay, so your homework is simply this. Email me your midterm exam as elaborate or not as you'd like to answer. And as I say, none of the questions, I believe there's 34 of them, none of them will catch you by surprise. And trust me, between this exam and the final, which will be just like it, except it will cover everything that we didn't cover, I guarantee you, if you get the answers to these pretty well down in your toolbox, you'll be pretty equipped to deal with a lot of things. I mean, it's by no means all encompassing. We're just like scratching the surface, but it'll give you a good ammo. So, okay?
Yes.
See, I told you. Wow.
Perfect.
1 minute,
Yeah.
1 minute to
Still
spare.
money.
You started late too.
I started late. So, okay, hope you guys got all that.
All right.
And we will, I'll talk to you on Monday. And email me. I will email out to everybody the exam for you to then fill out. All right, bye-bye.